So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our host, our interlocutor for today, Rory Hyde. Rory, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Nice to see everyone. Good to be here. So it is especially nice, actually, given that Mel and I have both escaped from London recently. So Mel was there leading the Spatial Practices course at Central St Martin's, at University of Arts, and before that we were both at RMIT. So there's a nice circularity in being here back in Melbourne together. Mel is now Professor and Head of Architecture at Monash University, and this book was made, though, while you're in London, and as I understand it, it's a kind of summation of your work at CSM, where you were really instrumental in defining and nurturing a form of architecture that's critical, political, grounded, socially engaged, drawing together an impressive roster of faculty and shaping the careers of many students over the past 7 or 8 years. How long? 8? 8. So it's a kind of theoretical and practical framework for this kind of engaged work, and a platform for many of the voices of those who've contributed to shaping that culture of the school and beyond. I will now hand over to you, Mel, to give a short presentation, and then we'll have a discussion after, so please think up some questions as we go. Oh dear. And we will take questions from the floor. I'll ask a couple and we'll take some from you as well, so please consider them as we go through. Please welcome Mel.
Thank you. You don't have to clap. Oh, just get used to my voice on that. Thanks very much to Matt and to Uro for hosting this, and to Rory for agreeing to be my support act and introducer. That's really nice of him, especially because he's virtually emceed the bookshop over the last 2 days and done his own book launch. So I really appreciate that, and thank you to all the friendly faces. I know a lot of you, so it's really nice to see you here. And this is hopefully a relatively light skip through this book and an opportunity to talk about it, and also an opportunity for you to ask questions if you want to, so feel free. Very relaxed. We're not going to be too intensive on our questioning, are we, Rory? It's all going to be...
I've got them written down.
And the reason for that is partly, so this book is, as Rory says, it's a bit of a summative book about this milestone of being at Central St Martin's, a School of Art and Design. And so the book was actually released a year ago, so it's a little bit old, but COVID has delayed the launch. And I guess it's also something that I've been interested in most of my career, which is this spectrum between those people who make architecture and those people who use architecture, and a sort of charting of that spectrum. It's always been my perception that the making of architecture exists more in the sort of public and domain in terms of how we think about it than those who use it. And as a little anecdote, Andy's at the back there, and Kath and I was going to say a little anecdote in terms of Design Week was that it was really nice to go to an event called Homemade, where residents were talking about their experience of living in those new models of housing, because it's so rare in which we talk about the spectrum on the side of the use of architecture. So I guess this book was really about trying to give a bit of space to talk about the spectrum and the place where people who are not trained in architecture but nevertheless are practitioners, or practitioners even just normal people, could find a place. So that's the broad introduction. And maybe one other thing to say is the book came out of a series of events over 3 years, which were held in a round table outside the college at Central St Martin's. So this is a public space. And in its own tiny way, that was about having conversations about broader practices, spatial practices, in a place where broader audiences, more plural audiences could listen. So I should say that those round tables were done with all the colleagues at Central St Martin's, and the people who were participating in them was a huge range, and so very much thanks to all them, because some of them made it into the book, some didn't, but the conversations were really critical. So that included the passers-by and general public, and in a way that was a sort of a practice in its right that gave rise to the sense of a book. So what's the book about? I thought maybe just to frame anybody who might want to buy it or know a bit more about it, I would run through the contributors, and that's partly because it's an edited book, obviously, and I framed it and curated it, but ultimately it's made up of all of those people's pieces of writing. Most of them are located in other places in the world. I don't think there's a single person from Australia, so none of them are here. So a shout out to them, and that's really what I was going to do, is just quickly run through their contributions with sort of images for each person. But I should say that I started the book and sort of framed it with an essay that was really asking how space is political, which in a way if we're interested in social and political space, we talk about this a lot. And I felt that the book was framing some practices that purported to be socially orientated or political, but maybe my chapter starts off by framing that a bit more, not super deeply, but in terms of the literature and the sort of work over the last, 50 years in which this sort of practice has been, I guess the sort of space, time and geography of space has been become popular, let's say. Richard Rogers said at one point in about 7 years ago that architecture is always political. And he said it at the Houses of Parliament, I think, as a sort of representative of the of a creative industries, I guess, trying to talk about the challenge of housing crisis, social displacement, gentrification, and architecture's role in that. But I thought what was quite interesting was that only a few years later, his phrase "architecture is always political" was sort of up front on a sign. By Architects for Social Housing, when he himself was awarded, I think it was the Sterling Prize, that's right, for some luxury housing at Bankside that has a rather appalling sort of track record in terms of affordability. So this sense of architects making claims for social political work at the same time as sort of somehow not really accommodating that frames some of the book as well. Hence why there's not a lot of reference to architecture, although ultimately it's underpinned by ideas about broader architectural practices. So I'm going to run through quite quickly, so it won't take long. Don't worry about the pages, don't get frightened about this. But I might read some of the sentences so I don't forget. So at one end of the spectrum, the first section of the book describes practices which operate as a mode of resistance. And I guess the first section was about saying, when do people make spatial practice without being spatial practitioners by trade or experts? And so we started off with Carl Fraser, and Carl's a really interesting writer and thinker and activist, and he argued that protest is a critical spatial practice in his chapter, a way in which citizens and citizenry are able to explore and affect the city, changing the way they relate to each other and challenging effectively through spatial occupation. So it started off in that way, and I think it's that reference to other spatial practices like squatting is really important here. How we make space ourselves without being designers, how we make space for protest and resistance, and we see that enormously and ever more at the moment. The next chapter is by Ursula Dimitrio, who's a practitioner and comes from Greece, and she was really talking about how spatial practice has been sort of used by the citizens in Athens post 2008 in trying to understand and create collective spaces. So these are stills from her video. She writes about that experience of Athens and the sort of anarchic eking out of the commons, which is so there's also a bit of reference to what the commons is. The next chapter is by a non-architect called Donna Turnbull, and she's a community activist with Voluntary Action Camden, so definitely the book has non-architect authors within it, and that was really important. So Donna's practice has been experiences through Deptford, Peckham and Somerstown, and I should say the book is quite Euro-focused, placing those sorts of places that are subject to the withdrawal of the state, survival of the fittest sort of agendas, and the way in which voluntary spatial activism really makes space, creates new possibilities in areas of challenge and regeneration. So that idea about neighbourhood planning as a spatial practice is part of what Donna talks about. Daisy Froud, who is a non-architect but has worked with an architectural practice in the past, but broadly now operates a business, I would say a model, a studio, which is about working on co-production between architects, planners and non-professionals. And she really looks at the facilitation of communities in making space when they're in those situations where new spaces are being put upon them. So this is work that she's done with Tower Court residents. Actually, there's a picture of Liza Fjords in there because she's one of the architects working on this project. But this idea that I guess as the section moves on, it's about this mutation from voluntary spatial activism to a sort of supported spatial activism by facilitators or enablers or people who are maybe at the fringes of architecture, but nevertheless are starting to be able to work with communities to do effectively to frame their resistance to what might be happening to them. The next chapter is by Alex Warnock-Smith, and it really is a small history moment in the book, and it talks about something you may not know much about, I certainly didn't, the Support, which is a community design building service from the 70s in the UK. It was very much an sort of opportunity to support, again, this is 50 years ago, let's face it, support communities in how parts of the city were being remade around them. And I found this really interesting. Hugo Hinsley was the person who set up Support, and he had a radical spatial practice that was committed to squatting, alternative forms of housing, and a form of resistance which really disrupted conventional architectural ways into housing. Following up on that, in a way, someone who might be, a practice that might have responded to that very much more contemporarily, now broken up, but exists, the French Collective, super interested in the way that you can effectively squat space and produce proposals for space with people in place. So this is a site that's quite famous now in Southwark, the Southwark Lido. It was a development site for many years, and this is their pop-up Lido. I mean, we see a lot of pop-up now, and in a way it's been sort of, let's say, sometimes discredited as a sort of technique, but I think can sort of were really some of the originators of this sort of movement, and actually quite radical in the way that they looked at do-it-yourself space or hack space as both practical and performative. And finally, Oscar Brito talks about a situation in Liverpool. This is a community land trust. So this is, again, a sort of something that's emerged in the last 10 to 15 years, this opportunity for communities to start to frame their own forms of approach to housing. This was Granby Four Streets in Toxteth in Liverpool, an area subject to effectively managed decline, boarding up of terraced housing, and the sort of prospect of regeneration. And through forming a community land trust, Granby Four Streets really resisted that and remade its sort of street effectively. So you might have heard of Granby Four Streets also being helped by Assemble. And that's not in this chapter, and I think it's because one of the misnomers was that Assemble made this project, where actually, and not saying anything against Assemble, it was actually the Community Land Trust that drove this project, and Assemble came in afterwards to help form some spaces. So the second section then starts to, I guess, move from that sense of communities doing it for themselves spatially into spatial practitioners or broader practitioners, and engaging with this question of how you help people or support people or enable people. So the first one is Ash Sakula, so Canny Ash from an architectural practice engaged in this project, Canning Town Caravanserai. This was a project part of the meanwhile a temporary projects running up to the London Olympics, very much about big pieces of land coming up for grabs, and actually a sort of a London local authority led programme by the London Borough of Newham to look at meanwhile space. So the Caravanserai, super interesting, also super problematic in other ways, because this is now a sort of high-rise building and there's no trace of the sorts of community networks that formed. Also sort of, again, in that sense of architects working somewhat complicitly, somewhat resistantly in regeneration sites. This is OOZE. OOZE worked with Marjetka Potrik, the artist, on and they were commissioned actually for an art project in the King's Cross site. So this is just on the borders of our building, our being my previous role. And this was a swimming pool for limited duration. It was a public art commission. But what was interesting about this project and why it's in the chapter is because it became effectively the tool for a load of local residents to resist. So this was a 9-month project, and it was all sorts of protests by local residents in King's Cross to maintain it for a long time. It was basically a natural water swimming pool in a pile of rubble on the site, and that was the sort of art project. But effectively it became a very beautiful sort of natural spot. The water was purified, only 60 people could swim a day, and it just became a sort of signifier of when art projects that might look at transitional regeneration actually become tools for community action in their own good. Moving on, a favourite of mine, Jeanne van Heeswijk, who is a Dutch, an artist from Rotterdam, and her work, which was a retrospective in Philadelphia Assembled, she really talks about, this was a retrospective that she turned on its head, and it became very much about exploring ideas of publicness, pretty much hosting community organisations in Philadelphia, looking at sovereignty into a series, into the budget of her retrospective. Her work's very interesting because it looks at how we can collectivise, and so she sees herself as a practitioner who's helping people to collectivise, which she calls training for the not yet. There's a art practice Air who talk about, in an experimental chapter, talk about walking as a urban spatial practice, and another project looks at Glastonbury as a form, the festival as a spatial practice. This is some mapping that Juliet did as part of a research project, looking at the way in which the music festival effectively creates an instant city, and how that sort of social interaction of instantness is really something we all want within city design and we rarely get. Then Raumlabor, Andreas Lang talked to Raumlabor, the German really architecture and art collective, about their work in Tempelhof, and this is the floating university, and a wider really conversation on frameworks for how artists, architects and others, communities can create frameworks of experimentation, urban pedagogy. I'll speed up because we can't go through them all in this much detail, but we're nearly at the end. There's a chapter by Tricia Austin, who runs the MA Narrative Environments, which is a multidisciplinary course at Central St Martin's. She talks about narrative as a tool of spatial practice. And Aberrant Architecture, who develop mobile, small infrastructures. This is a tiny travelling theatre, and really understand practice as an installation or a sort of event, and the way in which, as architects, they've fine-tuned their practice into the creation of mobile events. And lastly, quite a famous project, and these are graduates of Central St Martin's, the Decorators. This is Ridley's Road Cafe. It's a cafe that was done to effectively regenerate Dalston Market. It was looking at how you went and bought food from traders and then brought them to the restaurant and had it cooked for you. It was an installation that they self-funded, so in a way they were a young practice, not architectural but multidisciplinary, who funded their own work. So this model of how work actually gets done is sort of brought up in this chapter. They've since been taken on as sort of funded from above, but at this stage from below. Teddy Cruz writes a chapter, very much a Teddy Cruz chapter, about broader understandings of how we might train. And so this moves into this final section, which is really about strategies for how we disrupt education and disrupt effectively sort of planning and government and commissioning practice to better allow this part of the spectrum, the use of architecture, to come in. So Teddy, you probably all know his work in San Diego on the border. There's an interview with Muff, and this is a great diagram which talks really about this constant being in an architectural environment in which you need to constantly balance the level to which you're complicit in forces of regeneration, building and construction industry, and the level to which you're resistant to them, and keeping above the line, meaning keeping your sort of ethical frameworks in a way intact. There's Damon Rich provided a chapter. He's the Centre for Urban Pedagogy. He's also been a Newark planner. Fantastic practice, and really looking at how you understand that everybody needs to learn how to operate within the city. So hence this idea about urban pedagogy and how we need to sort of better enable all citizenry to sort of engage at that level. And last few, we have Andreas Lang talking about public works, a practice that's very much focused on building in learning into built projects. There's also a chapter from Jeremy Till, which I don't have a picture about, which really talks about how conservative architectural education is and how we need to sort of disrupt that in order to really upend this notion that we're always talking from the view of the maker of architecture. There's also a chapter from Finn Williams and Pooja Agrawal, who set up this public practice enterprise, a social enterprise looking at encouraging young architects into the planning sector, so to move outside of architecture and to move into planning for the public good. And some of their research that they do, they place people within local authorities in London, incredibly successful, really looking at them not as designers, but as wider policy makers and framers of projects. And last but not least, Peggy Deemer talks about, I mean, she was sort of instrumental in setting up the architecture lobby, but she also, in this chapter particularly, talks about how design practices can work against this sort of only working on half of the spectrum and be the key to transforming the social dimension of architecture by adopting cooperative structures and really pushing against the sort of natural inclination of construction industry approaches. And she's very smart and very practical in the way she thinks about how business and how labour is paid for within the spatial practices. So that's the end. Sorry, that probably took way longer than I should have. I'll stop now, but I do think it's important to credit every single person who contributed, because ultimately I didn't write all this stuff. I just got them to write for the book, and yeah, thank you.
We've got loads of time. Thank you, Mel. I wanted to start with something which you mentioned you use as the sort of opening to your intro, which is the 2008 crash as a catalyst for much of this kind of work. And perhaps you could say something about what kind of impact you felt that had on architecture, and even perhaps whether we're going through another similar moment now.
I think I did frame it as maybe a very current and contemporary condition of where I felt, and I still think this is the case, it's that people feel more and more out of control with relationship to bigger structures and infrastructures of government, of globalism, consumerism, and I guess capital. And in doing so, there's a sort of increasing desire for people to do stuff for themselves. So there's a lot of interest in the commons and in how we might collaborate. Everything from community gardens to co-housing. So this sort of, I think it's always been there, but it's come to the surface much more within practitioners' sites. I mean, that might be me reinventing the wheel. It might have always been there. But I think it's definitely a sort of tidal wave since 2008, and maybe again this sense of how you resist within your own agency to resist as a practitioner or in spatial practitioner. So I think it is really current, and I think some of that has come through in this latest sort of crisis in terms of people revisiting their control over how they work and live and how they move around cities. It just feels like there's more sort of opening up of questions.
I certainly feel that even like making your own bread is on a same like spectrum as making your own community.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you though about aesthetics, which is also tied into this, and something you tackle in the intro as well. The sense that a lot of this work, through its intentional provisionality and marginality, is it's often made out of milk crates and pallets and so on.
Yeah.
What's the role of aesthetics here? Is it problematic for this kind of work to be kind of tied to this DIY aesthetic?
I think what I sort of identified, and I think it's created a bit of a binary with mainstream architectural practice where perhaps the aesthetic of provisional, stuff, scaffolds, pallets, community gardens represents one side of a set of interests in design that's, and then there's another set which is, the architecture mainstream, sort of formalism, carefully designed, well-functioning buildings. And my perception is that binary has gradually sort of peeled apart a bit in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's become more entrenched. And I think that's very problematic, because for me, there's a spectrum in which, by being a binary, all we do is somehow throw architecture in the bin and say, on the one hand, and ditto a sort of an approach with more agency, or that's sort of more understanding of the user, becomes just that's all it is, and it doesn't have any sort of other traction into bigger forces like the construction industry and development. So I felt like the binary was a problem, and what I tried to address was, rather than thinking through aesthetics, we need to think of, that rather than thinking that simplistically, we need to rather think through what we're creating as a sort of, as a type of form. So event and the recreation of certain sorts of social infrastructure, soft infrastructure, is as much formal and interesting and important to architecture as hard infrastructure. So yeah, I think I certainly didn't solve that problem. I'm sure nobody could solve that problem, because I think unfortunately architects have been sort of slightly, again I agree with Jeremy Till here, that they've been sort of educated to be slightly sort of dismissive of the rubbishy, the venture playground sort of aesthetic, and it constantly comes up, this sort of binary. And I really think that it's a sort of destructive and a sort of a bit of a tangent that that doesn't serve effectively.
No, and as you say, it's entrenched on both sides.
Yeah,
and actually there's no middle ground here, especially when we're only talking about form and aesthetics.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have thought that even orthodox architecture could learn, and ought to learn, a lot from the strategies and techniques, whether or not they adopt the aesthetics.
That's right. And I also think what it does is it sort of totally takes away the formal from the sort of, let's say, spatial agency. And actually, there's a lot of very practical, logistical, physical bits and pieces that go up making cities work properly. And if you start to think, if you start to operate in that space, many very good architects operate in that space, which is, and Damon Riches very much talked about this in his chapter, which is you can't just operate as saying you're social and political. You rather have to enact that through things and through actions, and that's as much actions as physical bits and pieces, planning actions, policy actions, but also physical things like curbs and public toilets, and so it's not something that the separation is a problem, and it's entrenched on both sides. I totally agree.
No, I thought that Damon Rich's contribution was brilliant. He just for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
That, as he says, it's not enough to say you're political.
Yeah.
It's like, it was a bit of a personal attack.
Yeah.
Just to move on to the kind of, you're here now in Melbourne. I mean, most of the book is people from London. Really.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting looking through the images and the types of practices and the depth that is there in London. I mean, in a way, that's one of the reasons I went there, because it seems to be the sort of locus of a lot of this kind of thinking. And there's people like, the radical practices that you mentioned from the 1970s and 80s, feminist cooperatives, and then practices like MUF who come through in the 90s, have given a real breadth and depth to this type of social practice. And a breadth and depth which I would say doesn't exist here, actually. So is that what you're going to bring for us?
First I'd just slightly qualify it, because I think it's maybe in the last 8 years, my first, admittedly, 2 or 3 month snapshot is that it is here much more. I don't know whether global sort of shifts have all got closer because of just technology and the way that we taught. I mean, in the last 10 years, it just feels much more connected. So I have to say, when I first came to RMIT in 2004, I was a bit distressed that there was very little conversation, or maybe not. That's not true. There was, but it wasn't as widespread as I'd sort of experienced elsewhere. but I don't feel that as much now. So one thing is I think it does exist, and I think the appetite for it is really strongly there, as is the sort of practice. So I do think I don't find it as so absent. In terms of what I bring, I guess the trajectory I'm on is a little bit moving. Perhaps I'm really interested in all this stuff, but I'm also aware of the fact that the big criticism of this sort of stuff is it sort of fiddles around at the edges while Rome burns, you know, and that you can do a lot of small community projects that end up adding up to a lot of small community projects. Meanwhile, structurally, it's a bit like those memes that have come through about the boat, you know, the ship stuck in the canal, where there's the ship and it says structural problems, and then there's a little digger trying to scrape out the sand, and that says, you know, somebody trying to do...
Like doing your recycling or...
Yeah, recycling or setting up a community garden. So I guess maybe it's, I don't know.
I feel a bit like the digger.
I feel a bit like maybe my time might be best start to spend on the big ship stuff.
Yes.
And I'm quite interested in that, partly because, so it sounds a bit like an about face from this, and it's not. It's more that I'm interested in how those big structural issues around commissioning architecture and the built environment really can be sort of, shifted and altered. And I feel like that's a place a lot of us need to put our effort and sort of, intelligence.
Exactly, because it's, I mean, that's the image you've painted is, very stark binary, but it's much more of a continuum in reality, isn't
absolutely.
it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure many of your graduates and faculty are not just doing community gardens, but they're, going into the public sector. I mean, the public practice is a great example of this, where people who are, critically minded and educated in that way then go into the very boring bureaucracy of a local council to try to change it from the inside.
And that is the thing that I think has changed. That's in the last 5 years. That's why the book ends on that. I guess, how do you infiltrate the structural? And those clues like architecture lobby, public practice, and things that I see happening here. In fact, over this weekend, I think some of that is at play now, and I think that's really an excellent place to put our attention.
Just to come back to education, sorry, I'm asking all the questions. I promised to let you ask questions, didn't I? What's the time? All right, I'll ask. Has anyone got a question? I'll ask one more. No, I'll keep that one more in case no one asks the question, and then I'll. Okay, very good. You'll have to yell into the microphone.
I was going to ask about education, like architectural education.
Yeah.
Jeremy tells right, and we're producing conservative practitioners. Are you planning to shake things up?
I'll just repeat that for the live stream. Architectural education, is it as conservative as Jeremy Till says it is? And will you change it?
Yeah, when Jeremy first said that, I felt a bit taken aback and a bit sort of slightly insulted being an architectural educationalist. Because he says that, and he is as well, but he's almost thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I suspect he's not interested in architectural education anymore. He just criticises it all the time. Having then thought about it, I've now decided he's right. It is incredibly conservative culture that exists. It continues to support its own habits, some of which are extremely positive and good, like the design studio. And it's not true that those haven't mutated and adapted to sort of things that we need to do, but structurally it's still the same as it was when the design studio was invented, 50 years ago at the AA. That's a bit weird. 50 years later, we haven't worked out how to, start to think about architectural education differently. So I think that is one of the places that I would put my time and effort, is how we, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because it is a very, I don't know if, having looked into other forms of higher education, I have to say architecture is taught incredibly well and incredibly in a really lively way, but it still does keep a sort of rather entrenched habits. So I definitely am interested and have been interested in the last few years in looking at part-time study, step-in, step-out study, work and learn, and some of the models that have come up in the UK. Some of them are a bit weird, but everything from architectural apprenticeships seems valid to me. So yeah, definitely.
Great question, thank you. Have we got more questions? Andy up in the cheap seats. Come on through. Or you shout it out.
I'm really interested in this idea of sort of cultural foundations and whether London perhaps is going through a renaissance of rediscovering a cultural basis that was there. That's kind of part one of the question. The second part is, what is that basis culture around publicness in Melbourne? Thinking about it as a sort of post-colonial sort of concept. So I'm interested in just how, sorry, that's a really good question.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you see the terror in my eyes? Shit.
It's a simpler question, which is, does Melbourne have this foundational culture of acting collectively to return to? And is this one of our problems?
Does Melbourne have a foundational culture of collectivity to return to?
Well, I'm being much kinder about Melbourne because I'm not fed up of it. I've only been here 3 months. But yeah, I know what you were talking about a little bit. I am English, and I do get the sort of the deeply lodged welfare state stuff that's in the UK post-war, and does create a slightly different, let's say, built environment history and legacy. I think that I have noticed a slightly less. But I actually, that's sort of gone by the by now. I mean, we've had, whatever it is, 40 years of conservatism in the UK with mainly a sort of tiny little blip of New Labour neoliberalism. And I think that's, frankly, you know, it's sort of slipping away. So I don't think there's quite so much of a, there's not so much of a difference anymore to me. I think that's where we are in the world, where some of those legacies are now actually slipping. It might have had a legacy of as a sort of, you know, but I don't know. I don't feel quite so positive about the UK's traction in that area anymore. I mean, there are a lot of good practices in this book, but I feel sure I could have found those around the world. I was focusing on Europe and London just because that's where I was. I actually feel like yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just optimistic. But I don't know enough about the foundational practices that Melbourne's got to know if that's... You probably know more than me.
Well, I think that's right. I think now that, you know, there's a big announcement of social housing and so on, and it's the time to lift up the history of social housing design and construction here, which perhaps, with the exception of the Housing Commission, Towers, was very good throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. So, you know, how do we remember those kinds of practices? And I think that's a job for, you know, historians and educators and so on.
Yeah.
Like us.
Yeah.
Other questions? Charity. I'm going to try to see how far this goes. I don't have to repeat it.
I was hoping you would just sum it up later on. Much more coherent. I'm interested in this question of the exhausted aesthetics of DIY and where we sit with that and the kind of problems around that. But I wonder whether it is something about material and making, and whether that focus on the aesthetics and whether they are exhausted or not kind of masks a bigger question around the materials that we use in the DIY practices. They're all embedded in, you know, global infrastructure networks, pallets, you know, trestles. All of these things speak to a much larger kind of network of problematic construction as well. And I am excited by people kind of co-opting that and disrupting that in ways, but I think we can't ignore that that's where those materials and those kind of objects come from. And I would say, in reference to the stuck boat and the digger, because I know you love the stuck boat. No one is enjoying it more than me. But the problem is not the digger or the stuck boat, the problem's the canal.
Yeah.
So, and those are larger transnational flows.
Yeah.
Thanks, Charity.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think the whole issue of the aesthetics is probably one that deserves about 3 books on its own. Like, I really do think that's underdone. And I merely dabbled in it, to be honest.
But perhaps you could speak to the point of making, which
Yeah.
is certainly a big part of the school that you developed at CSU.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that maybe the middle ground, like the canal, the middle ground is how we in architectural education develop a stronger traction and training for physically making stuff again in order that to be engaged in that practice, and that's certainly what I did at Central St Martin's, is just sort of really develop this strand of building with your own hands, partly because it's fun and engaging as a form of education, but also because it makes you realise how much wastage there is in that process, how much what standards mean, economies, also how heavy things are. A lot of stuff that architecture education has moved away from, you know, and has a tendency to move away from, whereas, let's say, practitioners tend to remain a bit more in touch with. So yeah, I think the material stuff is actually, strangely, because it comes a bit left field, is actually a really good focus through which to think about it all. Yeah, and I other than, I haven't got anything intelligent to say other than that. yeah, more making stuff.
Thank you. Alexis, again, out the back.
Come through. I'll shout out from here. I'm just curious about the extent to which you see these different actors forming networks between them, and also I think the role of like exhibitions and books in kind of disseminating this type of practice as well.
Networks between those. Yeah, I think that's part of what I was doing in sort of bringing them together as speakers, is to sort of see them as a slightly more powerful strand of a culture than just individually, and also to see that as not only coming out of architecture, art, or other, but out of a sort of broader strand of people doing stuff. So I think I don't think I'm answering your question very well, but I think. I do think that there is a network. I also think that where that network has sort of, where it's most of that network who are really sort of, for me, finding their feet, like Jeanne van Heeswijk is an artist, but to me she's totally on the button in talking about how we collectivise and educating how to collectivise, because that is something we all need to have more training in. And her training for the not yet, I totally love it. But that idea of moving again up towards the sort of structural, even though she's a visual artist, you know, does one-off projects, but over her career, probably 30 years of engaging with, you know, spaces, she's moved into this totally different sort of an agenda. And so, yeah, I think many of these practitioners are in that same sort of trajectory, and it's a bit like the trajectory at the end with, you know, public practice and people actually putting processes in place that might change stuff at a broader scale, or might give people agency at the level of a whole town, or, you know. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think that's my response.
It does, but sorry if I missed that. But maybe just also, do you think that those networks then become self-reinforcing? Like, do they strengthen knowledge sharing between different actors so that they can actually start to learn from each other as well?
I think possibly, but I think at the moment, unfortunately, they still fit into they still fall into a little bit of the clique of the design world. So if I'm honestly totally frank, I still think that many of these practitioners are operating at a slightly smaller level, and the sort of interlinking is up to people like the architecture lobby or other bigger sorts of, and the other group who builds your architecture. Quite interesting groups that have sort of worked out that, you know, it has to be across everywhere. But I still think that the conversation is a little bit in our world and not in the broader world. So I don't know how to, yeah.
Well, I think that's what's interesting about Muff's diagram, stay above the line. I mean, these are a practice who are working with property developers, are working with regeneration projects, but whereas if you're doing your own community garden, you don't ever put your own ethics at risk because you have all the control. So as soon as you start to engage with the ship, then you need to have different strategies to maintain, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll take, I think, two more questions. We've got one here and one at the back. So we'll go
Yeah, I have a question. I think what is interesting about a lot of those practices is that they have different organizational structures, from co-ops to networks to other ways of gaining agency over processes of design and decision making. I was wondering whether that's a part of the book, and whether there's a space in education for addressing those novel forms of organization.
Definitely, it probably didn't take enough. It's like the book where the book was old before it was finished and you'd moved on to the next one.
Look it up.
No, sorry, no, it's great, sorry.
Book launch.
Yeah. No, it's fine. No, but what I mean is there's a second part which I think is extracting out some of those forms of organisation, because I totally agree with you that, and that's something I'm really interested in education, is how we sort of more broadly understand how to come together, how to self-organise, how to set stuff up. I mean, slightly entrepreneurial skills, but also other sorts of levels. What was the second part of the question, though?
Well, it was what do the role in education is.
Yeah.
Reflect on those negative new models.
Yeah.
Understand models from the past.
Yeah. I think it goes back to the answer, an architectural education answer, which is I think we are really conservative in just educating about design and not educating about, God forbid, business or setting up organisations or engaging in, higher level sort of situating ourselves within government or so on. So I think that's super underdone, and that's the sort of conservatism that I think Jeremy means when he talks about conservatism. It's not that design is not worth educating for, it's that it's suddenly got the traction needs to be at the sort of macro scale in order to get stuff done. And we definitely don't teach it. I mean, in professional practice, in my typical experience, including at my schools that I've been with, we barely have a sort of course about business. And what was amazing was that we did a survey in Central St Martin's across the art school, so this is performance, fine art, and the biggest clamour was for help setting up organisations which could have leverage and not just being some sole practitioner with sort of crappy income and blah blah. So I think younger people need that and realise that, and we're not providing it.
Okay, we'll do one final question.
Okay, I shouldn't talk the book down. It's a wonderful book. I will buy one. In some way, I think it's like the step one of this next shift. The next book, I hope, or maybe not.
Yeah.
At some point, the structural book. And I guess just on that, I think maybe there is, last 10, 15 years, this moving away from this division between this kind of practice and more structural practice. And if you were to speculate a little bit about what that book would look like and who it might involve, what, can you give us a little bit of a picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be more clearly inserting itself into the sort of commissioning of the built environment, from construction industry to development, to whatever small leverage government has. It would be about understanding some of those sectors, or certainly profiling them a little bit more carefully in terms of, I think it needs, some work needs to be done in finding, there's a very good, actually, the best way I can say this by referring to someone more intelligent. So David Harvey's got this book, Rebel Cities, which is really good. And one of the things he says is, capitalism will never win because, or, that's nice, hopeful, because it needs, it self-creates the sort of constant resistance to itself as a new market. So I feel that a little bit in regeneration and built and cities and city making is it has to accommodate some level of sort of popularity, or let's say a broader base for us all to, otherwise it's not going to work. So there's a sort of a chink in the armour where you can probably get in, and I don't think enough of us are getting in to have that conversation with those bigger forces, partly because we're put off by those bigger forces. And I'm really super interested in those people, like this person out there, who get into the chink in the armour a bit and sort of operate in that domain. So I guess, yeah, profiling how that works, how you do it, and what are some of the really pragmatic and, you know, challenges to doing it, and still coming up with your head above the, you know, line, because the scale in which things are done and the finance and capital required to do them does require engagement and rethinking, and yeah, it's not my that's the next project.
Well, that sounds like a great book. Unfortunately, all we have is this one.
Toilet paper.
No, it's a beautiful book. It's a fantastic book.
Is a year old, sorry.
The book is for sale outside. Please, thanks to Mel Dodd.
And thanks to Rory.